We've been wrestling with the idea of consent. What counts as genuine consent? What is a truly voluntary exchange? Even where there may not be a gun to someone's head, many would say a choice made under conditions of desperate poverty, let's say, is not truly free. So this is one big question that we need to resolve anytime we're trying to decide whether to use markets or not. How voluntary is the exchange? How free is the choice? How true is the consent? Or is it beclouded and pressured by economic necessity or by lack of information? So that issue is clear. But there is another kind of question, another kind of ethical question that arises when we try to figure out whether there's anything wrong with commodifying the human body or our body parts that may not have to do with tainted consent. Take the example of prostitution. One of the main arguments people make when they oppose prostitution is it's not truly voluntary in many cases because the people who are going to prostitution are pressured by poverty or drug addiction or the threat of violence and so on. That's a familiar consent argument. But let's take the case of a prostitute who's not desperately poor, but who chooses the work freely. Is there any further moral objection to selling sex or selling one's body for sex?
The concern here would be that the commodification of sex would somehow corrupt the value of sex.
Wait, spell that out a little bit. What does it mean that commodifying sex corrupts the meaning of sex?
It would be something that was very special. It would be something that was undertaken by two people who are very much in love. And one could argue that if you put a price on sex, you somehow cheapen it. But at the same time, I think people have enough agency to understand the difference between prostitution and sex in that form, and sex in the sense of two people who are married and living their lives together.
Ryan?
Again, and I've mentioned before, we can't legislate morality. We can't move towards a moral end goal that I think is impossible to achieve.
Well, wait. You've said this a few times. We can't legislate morality.
Yeah.
Do you mean as a practical matter, it's hard to enforce?
Yes.
Or do you mean that ethically speaking, or from the standpoint of justice, it's wrong to even try to legislate
Yes, I
morality?
agree. We can't.
Which?
The latter. We cannot expect everybody to have the same moral end goals. We cannot prevent prostitution because of that. It will inevitably happen.
Now you're sliding back into the enforcement problem.
Sure, okay.
I want to know whether you have a principled objection to what some call paternalist legislation.
I do, yes.
And what is that objection?
There's the view that everybody has to adopt the same set of morals, and that there has to be a set of morals that has to be legislated across a cross-section of society, and I think that's unrealistic. I disagree with that on every front.
Lindsay?
I agree with you completely based on this idea of liberal neutrality in which laws should not adhere to any one moral standard and force one moral standard upon society. In this particular circumstance, given that there is full consent, I don't believe that the state has the authority to impose its moral view on consenting adults.
Jamie?
That's what laws are. Laws are the minimum moral standard that are shared and imposed on society. There are people who would accept physical abuse, yet we impose on them that in our society we hold that below our lowest moral standards, which we call the legal system.
But those are issues which affect someone else's rights. Prostitution, that's not interfering with anybody's rights. That's a consensual transaction. With something like abuse, that is not consensual.
All right, there are two issues here. One of them is the question of whether, tainted consent aside, there is something morally objectionable to prostitution, to selling sex for money. And Ellie has suggested, yes, maybe there is, that selling sex corrupts its meaning, its higher meaning. And then there's the second question, which is what the law should be. Whether that moral concern about corrupting or degrading human sexuality should be embodied in law, and that's where Lindsay and Jamie were disagreeing about whether the law should embody morality. Go ahead, Matt.
I'd like to respond to the corruption argument.
Yeah.
I feel like it assumes a single view of what sex means. in a pluralistic society. For some people, they'll agree with you it should be between two people in a binding relationship, but for others it's a casual thing. They should be able to commodify it. If, for example, I'm someone in a relationship and I can have sex with either a prostitute or my girlfriend, and the prostitute would offer sex for like $500 or something, and I have sex with my girlfriend, I'm not thinking in the back of my mind, I'm getting $500 worth of sex right now. So I don't think there's that corruptive
No,
element
which is
to
why
it.
I said I think that individuals have enough agency to differentiate between those two types of sex.
We might not be able to necessarily agree on what sex is ideally, but perhaps there might be another thing of treating a person as an object. I would argue that a lot of people who pay for sex through prostitutes are not necessarily looking for sex, but actually looking for the act of having power over another person by purchasing something from them, treating them as an object rather than another human being. That might be another possible objection, an issue of objectification.
I think whether or not you engage in prostitution doesn't really affect the way you view sex. If you objectify women, whether or not you hire a prostitute, doesn't really affect your view on women.
I agree with Jamie. Law is morality in some sense. Like, you are legislating like what is proper for people to do, what should be illicit. And when you're thinking about like, okay, if prostitution should be legal, what are the kinds of things that we have to think about so nobody gets hurt and everybody is giving consent? But it's all about like what the society decides is valued, which is really hard to come to.
But you're not opposed in principle to embodying moral judgments in law.
That's what law is. Yeah. It is regulating behavior, and there is implicit judgment in that. You can't avoid it.
Implicit moral.
You're saying that morality is in laws, and I'm saying that they should be neutral.
If prostitution is legal, the law is implicitly saying that this is an okay thing to do.
I think
it's saying that it's morally permissible.
It's morally permissible. It's not illicit.
I think we disagree on the purpose of laws. I think the purpose of laws is keeping individual rights. I don't agree so much that there's a moral component to it.
How is there not?
Rather than protecting liberty and the rights of
yeah, because you believe that protecting liberty is a moral good, so you are saying that that's permissible.
Issues, though. I mean,
yeah.
Wait.
I think prostitution should be legal because of the fact that it's moral on liberty grounds and not on moral judgment grounds, which many people differ on.
I want to test that issue by considering another kind of job that's legally and morally controversial. Have you heard of dwarf tossing? Have you heard of it?
No.
Yeah. No. Yes.
All right, who can describe it? Who's read up on it?
Somebody buys the right to throw a little person.
Right, it's a game in pubs or bars where people of small stature, as they're called, put on protective gear and helmets and consent for pay to be thrown across the room into padded wall or something as a pub game, a kind of sport. And there have been debates in various countries, actually, debates in France, debates in Europe and in various American states about whether this should be banned.